samurai with a longsword, a Kenjutsu master's perspective. Now, followed Skallagrim for a little while, and love the man, love all the content that he puts out, and I did reach out, wanted to make sure that him, reacting to his content was going to be okay. He said, yeah, no, totally fine with reactions, just make sure you're not just sitting there blinking, which, you know me, chat, I have 5x reactions before, so thought I'd, give a little bit of input. I'm not a master by any means, I'm not an expert by any means, I go to SCA, I have a very fond interest, if you will, of, we'll call them martial arts for YouTube TOS. Someone that uses longsword, specifically German style in SCA. I bring a longsword to rapier. I'm an interesting person, let's put it that way. And as somebody whose SCA chapter has gone over manuals such as Godinho, they've gone over, I always forget the Italian one. There's a famous Italian manual that I always forget the name of. We go over that. I go over, 5 rings comes up consistently. I can't escape Musashi. That's the meme at this point. So naturally, you get into Musashi and Fate with waifu. It's a mess. But as somebody that has heard from translations of 5 rings, specifically my copy, that in Japan, these samurai would refer to what we know as katana to longswords because contextually they are longswords. I'm very curious from just the structural differences alone what the commentary on this is. I'm very, very interested in this.
All right, here's a video that people have asked me to talk about. Matt Eastner already has. I'm going to link that down below. I haven't watched that because I don't want to be influenced before I look at this, and I haven't pre-watched it either. I just want to give you my genuine off-the-cuff response to it. So this is an interesting video because what we normally hear about is the Western perspective on Japanese swords. It's
generally
people with background in historical European martial arts talking about the...
was there no Suba on that? I guess maybe that's how it... I can't tell. I don't think there's a Suba on that. The Suba being the circular handguard.
Arts, talking about the katana, trying to figure out how they would use it with what they're used to, their techniques. I've done the same. But here's the opposite. So a Kenjutsu background looking at the longsword and figuring out ways to use it. So of course, I'm going to link the video to Let's Ask SE Sensei.
I will be asking Seki Sensei as well. I have not as of recording this video because unfortunately YouTube only allows me to look at so many business emails per day. It's some weird number like 5. And I know it's an anti-spam feature. It just makes asking people if, hey, I'm reacting or have reacted to your content, are we okay with this? If not, please let me know. It just makes that unfortunately get a little messy. I'd be very interested in reaching out to them in regards to transformative content. So I'll be doing that after this when my YouTube emails reset. But he does bring up good points. We often hear the Western perspective, and something Musashi brings up that I love talking about is Musashi does talk about in the 5 rings, Niten Ichiryu, right? He brings up the path of the blade, where if you notice, and I'm going to go back on in the video a little bit, you notice how the katana's wanting to cut, right?
Their techniques.
It has a very specific way forward that it wants to cut.
Done the same.
And katana has been likened to more of a scalpel. It has a very specific way it wants to cut, which is different than, say, a kukri, right? A kukri is going to be more of a hacking motion, which is different than, say, a German longsword, right? Where you're going to have very... You set up those planes of steel, if that makes sense. How do I... So, if you are looking at your opponent, say this little... this line right here is you looking at your opponent, and you move to expel their blade, suddenly you're going to be, say, at this 90-degree angle, right? You're setting up planes with that sword. That sword is all leverage, and which is different than, say, a Messer or a Kriegsmesser, which you're going to use more of a, as far as I'm aware, more of a chopping motion. The path of the blade is something that Musashi has brought up, and I've thought about immensely because it's so true. You can't necessarily use a Messer the same way you would use a katana. You can't use an Odachi the same way you would maybe use an Italian or French rapier, right? I think at a general level, anybody, even if you're just coming into this, you have no idea about sword fighting, can say, yeah, that makes sense. The sword wants to move a very specific way.
So background looking at the longsword and figuring out ways to use it.
I'd be very interested on the Pomel specifically.
The video to Let's Ask SE Sensei, the channel that this video is on, and I'm not going to show you all of it because it's not my content. I want you to go there and watch it yourself, but just some parts of it to respond to.
平で叩けるかもしれない。あ、平で。
You might.
At worst case scenario, if Seki Sensei does not want this concert reacted to, this won't go up on the channel. But, you know, I will do my best to make sure that I'm providing as adequate commentary and respectful to both parties.
All right. I think this is something that Fiore could get behind.
That was the one. That was the one. Thank you, Skallagrim. That is the Italian manual that my SCA chapter loves. Fiore. We go over Godinho. I think he's Spanish. I think. I have to check. Fiore. Oh, God. My chapter loves Fiore. He brings up a lot of really, really good plays in regards to fencing. And, yeah. No, thank you, Skallagrim, for filling in the information that I once again forgot. I always forget Fiore. It's unfortunately a meme at this point. Like, I know him, I know his work, but I will always forget his name for some reason.
As he often shows the longsword, hand and a half sword, being used in one hand. You might wonder, why would you ever want to not use both hands? Because the other hand gives you more control over the weapon. It allows you to move more nimbly, and it gives you more leverage, more power, etc. That's all true.
I'm very curious on his take, because I have my SCA chapter's take. I have my own take, derivative of that. I'm very curious on Skallagrim's take.
But there are some situations where you might have to or want to use one hand, be it because the other hand is injured, or because you have to just draw quickly and respond to something.
Yeah.
Or because you want more reach.
You could also try to be pulling your strikes a little bit. So there's a very large difference than, say, if I'm using my backhand on the pommel to control the speed of that swing, right? It's very different if I'm doing that versus using a single hand, as I can cut down the amount of leverage immensely. If I have a longsword, right, and I were to do a two-handed strike, I'm kind of motioning, but you can't see because of my model. It's just not rigged that way, right? If I were to do a two-handed strike and I were to let the gas off, quote unquote, on that backhand before impact, it can disperse that force in a way that the impact is negligible. It's how to control there's a variety of methods. You could also be fighting in a confined space. You could be doing that as well. So in period, right, you get a bunch of hoodlums, rapscallions, if you will, that are going to corner you in an alley, and it's how do you fight in a confined space if you have a larger implement, right? Is a lot of what I remember going over from Fiore, I believe.
Anyway.
Or at least part of it.
This is probably...
Okay.
Interesting.
That's an interesting observation.
Kind of reminds me of a rapier at that point.
The guard the other way around. I mean, you can have that.
So he wants the keons rotated 90 degrees, so he's going to hold that. Interesting, actually.
Instead of holding the sword like this with the guard vertically,
an amazing sword.
Use the thumb grip to turn it around. So now you are holding.
Actually, I have seen this, and I've tried doing this. That thumb there is going to allow for a lot more finite control. 3 parts of the blade, right? You have your 3 parts of the blade. You have your weak, you have your middle section, you have your strong section, right? If you're binding, strong in the bind is generally going to be here. So it's sword things. And it's interesting because with this, instead of if I can actually get back to it, sorry, give me a second. Instead of having this, right, where this is more, I'm pointing this at you, this is going to go to you, right?
Use the
flipping it that way. Look how much more finesse you're going to have with that. You're going to just be able to thrust in, right? You're going to be able to thrust over a guard, potentially.
Grip to turn around. So now you are holding it exactly like that, which comes in handy in a number of ways, particularly for cuts like this.
Yeah.
The crooked cut, which is not done with a true edge. But
I think that's German. It's a very common play where you'll see people go above and beyond, kind of helicopter. I think it's Virchow. I can't remember the name of it. Very good play, though.
Seems pointless because you can just cut with the true edge, right? Why would you bother with that? Well, there are situations where that's useful. For example, if you want to sneak in over the guard, this comes in handy because this would be a kind of a weak position if you wanted to cut high like that. Yeah. Whereas this is stronger. Yes and no. They are very different in some ways, but both are a sword meant to be used in both hands. Both were used extensively in dueling, but also on the battlefield. And the way they handle, well, you can't make too many statements about that because
you're using a little bit different muscles. So for me, using chops and slashes, right, with a German longsword, right, is a little different than how these cuts are being made with this. I mean, I often hear that the katana is more of a scalpel. A longsword is going to be more of that hammer, right? It just different purposes. And I think it stresses a little bit different muscles, requires a little bit different technique. But for the most part, I think both of these, especially with modern metallurgy, could really go head-to-head pretty evenly.
So many different longswords that all have different weights and different balance and different grip lengths and different guards, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also some variation in Japanese swords. Of course, some are heavier, some are lighter, also different lengths, all of this. But I can see why you would say that they're different, especially since I'm assuming longswords are probably much less common in Japan than katanas are in the West.
I would actually say, without research, without numbers, I would say that that's a fairly accurate statement. I think there's a bit of a romanticized notion of katana because of, media like anime, manga, etc. And I'm not necessarily saying it's bad. I think that there's a bit of a romanticized notion that people are going to want katana. I know me when I go sword shopping, when I look for a new blade, is this going to be a ceremonial piece? Is this going to be a prop? I don't want any of that. I want cold, hard steel. I want to be able to smack people with it. Am I going to without the proper safety measures? No. I want that real deal, if you will. And I think that is also the case because of certain Japanese, I can't remember if they're sword or knife laws. I forgot the wording of them, but there are rules against owning blades and specifically bringing blades out, which that is going to delve into politics, and I really don't want to go into that. So I think that also does play a part there with the legality of blades over in Japan.
So you wouldn't be as familiar.
I hope this video will be interesting for anyone training with longswords to see what a katana master would think of doing with a longsword. However,
very interesting indeed. I definitely appreciate that this was made.
Again, we have no experience with He-Man longswords, so if you are making any mistakes or have any misunderstandings, please let us know in the comments.
I also appreciate the humble, respectful attitude here. That's something that some Knight fanboys could learn a thing or two from.
God, thank you, Skallagrim. Thank you for saying that. And also, I will use it's a common analogy, right? Or it's commonly known. I will use the common phrase and often used in the military phrase, if it works, it ain't stupid, right? If somebody does a weird guard that you're just like, that doesn't work, and they clearly beat you with it, well, clearly it wasn't that weird now, was it?
Yes. If you're not used to it, yes. In fact, there is something that at the old HEMA school that I used to practice that was referred to as the beginner bruise. It's pretty common to beat up your own forearm with the guard if you're not used to it. So that's
I don't think I've ever done that, actually.
Observation.
I don't think I've ever done that.
Especially in ox guard, it's pretty common for beginners to hit themselves in the forearm because, well, as you see right here.
Yeah.
It is in the way, kind of.
Like, the logic makes sense. I somehow have never done it. I guess maybe I'm less of a dingus than I thought, although I won't hold my breath on that. But this would track, yes.
Until you learn how to position yourself that it's not. So this way, the guard is away from my arm.
So he's in high guard?
Oh yeah, if you hold it that way, absolutely. Which you would with a katana, because not a problem, but it works.
Yeah.
But with a longsword, you have to hold it a little bit differently. Yeah, so holding the sword over the head like this is asking for trouble. So instead, you hold it here, on the side of your head, on either side.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually.
Or there.
You're also maintaining a lot of, at least, Western hobbies, SCA, Belagarth, etc., have taught the window, right? Where this is kind of your window you want to be in, but then that gets into a further conversation, which I'm not really versed on, which is infighting, which is going to be in this window. Outfighting is going to be anything outside this window. You're fighting, say, stabbing here, fighting people that have declared themselves as outfighters has been a very interesting experience. But this would keep you high, but it would also keep you within that window.
Or you simply hold it higher in the sense that you don't allow the tip to go too low. So if I hold it like this, it doesn't endanger my head.
That's poised. That will do something when it comes down. If you're back here, there's too much movement to get over here that your opponent can just thrust on in. It comes down to tempo, conservation of movement. We go over a lot of this in SCA, where, you know, if you make a big sweeping cut versus somebody coming in with a single stab or riposte, right, if you will, and it takes them less time to make that stab to get to you than the time it takes for you to make your big old swing to try and expel their blade, which one of these is going to win? It's going to come down to conservation of movement. It's going to come down to your tempo being faster than your opponent and making sure that you know where everything is, so to speak. And that's a lot of that's just muscle memory.
If you try to swing it like a katana, the handguard hits your head and shoulders.
Again, it's pretty common with beginners to have that happen. In fact, I remember doing that once or twice too, early on.
So SE Sensei has a question for any longsword trainees watching this video.
All right. Okay, could the guard be oriented the other way?
Yeah.
Yes, but it becomes a lot more awkward to carry. This way, you know, with the blade.
Portability issue. I can agree with this. I mean, I guess technically you could make the rapier argument because of the basket hilts and how rapiers during that Renaissance era evolved. They evolved from kind of this cross-guard Keons approach, and they started to get a little more, you know, a couple more Keons there, and they started to evolve the entire basket hilt. But you could also argue that that's a more compact design. I've seen some pretty big basket hilts, don't get me wrong, but it comes down to a portability issue. I think that this is a fair assessment.
Laid flat against the body. The guard is flat against the body too. So I have a number of ways to carry it. I can carry it here, or here, or here. And I can, if I need to, I can tuck it in pretty tight.
Yeah.
Also, it's...
There's your full-size Friday. Did you just bring an entire broadsword? Yeah. Respect.
Stacks nicely. Seems like a trivial reason, but if you were to throw a bunch of swords onto a cart to get ready for battle, it's kind of useful if you can just stack them on top of one another, as opposed to that sticking out in all.
That's a logistical thing as well, right? Are you going to be able to ship more... How do I word this? Are you going to be able to ship more M16 and M4 platforms? Or are you going to be able to ship more weird proprietary bulky platforms, right? I mean, we all know kind of what the M16 and M4 look like, right? And there are some weird chunky thing. Let's just say the P90, right? It's sure kind of flat, but it also its size specifically military variants, right? I mean, and I get in military personnel, if I'm off point here, you think there's a better analogy, please feel free to make it in the comments and I'll pin it. Right. It's a logistical thing. If you can say in a single cart, right, you can stack 200 M16s or M4s, but you can only haphazardly stack, you know, maybe 160 P90s, right? Especially with their proprietary mags, and, you know, that being a logistical nightmare as well, rather than just using regular magazines, right? I mean, which one of these is going to be more beneficial logistically, right? I know you know what I'm trying to say, but I don't have enough experience to make that point. So once again, if you have a better analogy in the comments, I will pin that.
Direction. So this way it can lie flat. If it was the other way around, you would have to carry it in front of the body, like that, so
would
that
be more
it's out of the way.
Katana-esque.
Which, for a long sword like this, is not really ideal because look how much is sticking out now. For carrying, this is more useful. That's also the reason why on a Messer, this additional guard here is only on...
Messer, they're knives. They're not swords, chat. They're knives. Those of you that know what I'm talking about know what I'm talking about. And I love you because you also study history.
On one side. Because this way, it still lies flat against my body. Of course, there are sword designs with fairly bulky hilts.
Yeah,
like
basket
the side
hilts.
sword here. And yes, this can jam you in the side. depending on how it's worn. But because it's single-handed, the grip isn't as long, it doesn't stick out as far. So you can allow it to ride a little bit further in the front so that it doesn't stick out quite so much. And yeah, it's not as comfortable as a flat one. But of course, in this case, you get so much hand protection that you're like, who cares? I'd rather be less comfortable than have a crippled hand.
Right.
I mean, you could if you made it smaller, but the point is to have a large guard that offers a lot of coverage. As it is, the guard covers some of the forearm, and it protects against...
I actually think I use that exact longsword now that I think about it. It wasn't Castile Armor that I got mine for. I can't remember who I got it from, but I use a very similar longsword to that one for my rapier.
Protects against strikes that come in low. And of course, it protects the hand against a blade sliding down. The real answer to guard orientation is both, because sometimes you do need it in the other direction too. I've had some moments in sparring where that additional guard on a messer that sticks out on the side really saved my hand. So
it's
really
such a
the
cool
Tsuba
thing.
protects against more angles. It just isn't very large. I find the best of both worlds is a longsword guard with side rings. It's much more...
I honestly used to be against the side rings until I started using longswords with side rings. Man, they put in work. Like, I have definitely had hands saved in sparring matches.
Protective, but more awkward to wear. Here's another way in which this guard orientation comes in. So if I want to win the bind, I turn the edge against...
So that's his true edge. His true edge is now false edge versus true edge. I'm not super educated on this subject. I have a basic understanding of it, where this would be the false edge, right? Sure, you can flick back, but where's the power here, right? This being your focus, being where you're moving, right? This would be classified as the true edge. And there's going to be minutia to that. Some experts and veterans can definitely fill in the gaps there where I'm definitely missing context. But so he is trying to win this bind at this point. Note that he's about, and there's a broad generalization, 3 parts of the sword: weak, medium, strong, right? But there's, I think, 5 to 7, potentially more, depending on where you're studying and what you're studying. I think there's more, but that's just a broad generalization. He's about the medium part of his blade to the medium to light part of his opponent's blade. He is trying to win the bind. He could also just flick like window wiper. He could window wiper and just expel right here.
The flat. And this in and of itself gives me a structural advantage. So if I try to push, hold against it, if I try to push flat against flat,
You see how hard it is to try and gain anything in that bind? How it's effectively a game of inches, and it comes down to effectively just a glorified arm wrestling contest.
both flex, and there's not that much going on. But
if you change your
turn
angle,
this, now I can push it much more easily.
Now imagine if you're in the same situation, but this second hand was on a pommel, right? It was on the pommel, and you're using the pommel, your lower hand, to rotate it this way. How much leverage you're going to have going this way. And that is why I love longswords.
Because it's more rigid in this direction than that. So that's one way. I also want to get the strong of my blade, which is the lower third, on the upper third of the opponent's blade, which is the weak. So
depending on your strength, and if you want to wind, I guess you could do... I really wouldn't say do strong on strong. I'm sure there's people that could win that. I'm not that strong. I'm pretty strong, but I've run into people that are like 6 foot something stacked, 300 plus pounds of pure muscle, mountains, and I'm just like, I ain't winning that, homie. I'm strong. I'm not that strong. You could theoretically, in Skallagrim's position, you could probably fight the medium of the blade. It might be a fight to win that, right? But it's not impossible. But yeah, the easiest way, you want your stronger section of the blade to win against their weaker section of the blade. But even then, even if you just expel their blade, right? Suddenly their blade is way out over here, and your blade is right in their gut. You know, part of me just thinks that I'm not good at sword fighting. It's just a random Kip aside. Maybe I really just need to actually go out to SEA more often, because clearly I know what I'm talking about to some degree. And this actually gets me excited to go to SEA on the weekly, which I've been really neglecting.
what happens when I do that? This.
And now you can just,
just
come on in.
So now I can bind, go in for a thrust safely, and it's not going to endanger my hand.
That actually comes down to a concept as well, 3 points of defense, where at least my SAO chapter in Rapier uses that. The first line of defense, his sword is blocking his opponent's sword. His second, his opponent's sword is out here. Even if his opponent could somehow, and they could probably just leverage up, right? He cannot do that in this time, do that and strike in before he's already been struck, right? He can't do that. His third, he does look like he's off center, which is a good thing, right? So if his sword is out here, right, and he expels it this way, even if he were to just push his blade forward, it is still off of him. I'm still very bad about getting that third line of defense, but it does come down to you need to make sure your opponent's sword is away from you. You need to make sure that even if they come in, you have a stance, you have a way of blocking it if it comes in. And a third line of defense is being off center, right? So his shoes right here are faced, say they're facing this way. He's a little off center from him, meaning that if he were to come in, it's not just a straight shot. He is off center from where his blade's point is. So 3 lines of defense. I know this has actually turned into a really weirdly educational bit, actually. I really love talking about this.
これはいいね。下のところでストッパーが。
Ah, a connoisseur, I see. The sensei likes the pommel.
You see that pommel?
He doesn't even know.
Hit him rightly. Oh my god. That is definitely not legal in SCA, as far as I'm aware. Maybe there could be a bait and switch with like a plush, like beanbag or something. I'd have to discuss that, but like, God, that is not, you can't do that. Not in SCA.
Because the end of the hilt is slightly larger, you can throw thrust the sword forward and
You
it stops
could,
in your
yeah.
hand. This is actually a technique you can do with the katana too. We'll make it.
Huh. I was aware of that.
Didn't even think of that.
Yeah, it's not something that you...
I wouldn't say it's a very strong gambit, but if you know what you're doing, clearly this man, Seki Sensei, right, knows what he's doing with 40 years in katana, specifically it sounds like Kenjutsu, right? He clearly knows what he's talking about, and he has my absolute respect. It's not common. It's a factor, though, right? It's not like... It's how ending them rightly throwing the pommel isn't common, but technically you have the one Italian manual that says it, and you have to be like cognizant of it, because someone in a legal format is going to come along and throw the pommel at you, and you're going to be called like, yeah, that's a game loss. You know it's going to happen.
Normally do. I'm not aware of any treatise that shows a sliding thrust like this. That's more a thing with polearms or spears,
oh my God.
but that's done differently. Either way.
Don't even get me started on polearms. I have had to fight. There's clips of me up. Maybe I'll have to get more of me trying to fight polearms. If people are interested in Kip sword fighting, I can throw some of that up on the main channel. I just need to know if people actually want to watch that stuff, because I'll armor up. I'll do that. Aside. Oh man, fighting polearms is rough. You think me with a longsword will have leverage? Now you have a polearm. Now you have a spear. You have to bait where that thing's going, and then you have to be really aggressive and close that gap. Because I have a very, very low win rate against spears and polearms. They're wild.
He has a good point here, because what you can do is let go with one hand and then thrust forward to get extra reach. When intending a single-handed thrust, for some people it would be most intuitive to let go with the offhand and do it like this, which you can.
Yeah.
But if you let go with the main hand and thrust with the offhand, you get that much more reach.
A little bit more reach, yeah. You're also turning into it.
I've done this in sparring before.
You're also turning into it, which is relevant. Because if your opponent's aiming at your shoulder here, right? Because you kind of want to know where you're shooting, right? If Skallagrim is standing like this, right? If I was fighting Skallagrim for some reason, right? And I'm like, well, I want to shoot for his left shoulder, right? And I shoot my shot at his left shoulder, but he does this. Suddenly I'm missing his left shoulder if he does it fast enough. Sure, it's a gamble, going into this, right? But if I overshoot, now he's here. Now he's in my face. It's so good. I love combat.
Much more reach. And I've done this in sparring before. Now, I was still a little bit too far for a deep thrust, but then again, it was a kneecap, so it doesn't take all that much. So,
well, in SCA, all you need is point on, right? You just need to, just at least in rapier form, you just need to hit them. Or if you kind of slash at them, if you draw cut, it counts as well. heavy and cut and thrust are a little different.
Oh, this can be useful. The downside is now there's a longer lever that the opponent can use against you.
Yeah.
So if your opponent hits the blade up here while you hold it there, you're
if they
in
expel
trouble
it, yeah, it's
because you
out of
have
there.
no control
It's
over
out.
it. It's still true if you hold it this way. You know, any knock there will be much harder to resist than if you have both hands on it.
Yeah.
But this is worse. But it's a trade-off.
It's also knowing your opponent, right? If you're going up against a polearm, which chat's saying polearms are a problem. Like, they're meta in melees. They always have been. If you're going up against a polearm or a spear, probably wouldn't use this. If you're going up against, God, maybe dagger and short sword, right? Or I was going to say buckler and sword. I could maybe see an argument for that. Yeah, I could totally see that. Opposing longsword, I mean, I think that comes down to the skill level of both participants, but you could absolutely do that. Shield, like large shield, cloak, right? Off defensive implement cloak, probably wouldn't do it. It just depends. Depends on the fighter, depends on the situation.
Because the idea is you would just quickly do this and immediately pull it back again.
It's a jab.
You can do the same thing with a cut. You know, you would just quickly snipe to the opponent's leg and try to, as quickly as possible, go back to a guard, have both hands on for more control. And the pommel helps keep it in your hand in that case.
When he tried half swording, we found a problem.
Yeah.
I've had that happen.
I think it could also come down to form. It could also come down to muscle memory. Because, like, on a katana, right, you have the Suba. I'm not very good at fighting with Suba. Someone like Seki Sensei, even Skallagrim, is going to be a lot better at fighting with a Suba rather than a cross guard than I am, right? It could just be weight, it could be form, it could be a number of things. But I mean, absolutely, yeah, no, the Keons, some things do get stuck. There's no really getting around that in certain situations. And even if it's a perfect situation, maybe you were pushed by your opponent into a disadvantageous position, and wow, it's, yeah, my Keons just got stuck. It happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so good. You see what he's doing? He's using that leverage to just stop the incoming strike. He just rotated, right? Rotated in, stopped that momentum, expelled his blade in one go, and now he's in his face.
Yeah. There are a number of ways. You can use a flat, you can use either edge. You know, it has somewhat different effects. The drawback, of course, always of using the flat is that it's not as rigid. That's a difference between the katana and the longsword. A katana is very rigid generally, whereas a longsword has more flex.
Yeah.
So it's not quite as stout in using the flat.
Yeah.
But it's perfectly possible.
I could maybe see you doing this as a claymore. Pretty stout, pretty rigid, right?
There are even strikes with the flat in some of the manuscripts.
I take that back. There's better ways to use a claymore because you want to keep your whirlwind going up, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. I haven't seen that technique in HEMA, but it makes sense.
I might have to bring that up to our SCA chapter.
Yeah.
At the very least, this would probably interest them because cross country, cross practice usage of styles, right? That'd be very interesting.
You can definitely do that. Yeah. That's the thing. These techniques are not that different.
In traditional Japanese Kenjutsu, effectively using the shinogi to block, parry, and attack is very important.
Yeah.
That's something that you would do more with a messer. Now, to reiterate, a Kriegsmesser is not a European katana. The blade...
It's really not. Whoa, do other people that actually think this? What? I've never heard this be a hot take. That is the furthest thing, that those are not even the same. Whoa.
Profile is different, the way it's made, the guard is different, the grip is different. In terms of usage, there's going to be more similarity. Yeah. And you can use...
Well, yeah, similarity means, you know, it's similar. It's not the same. Like, you can have things about it, right? I mean, we can tell from basic structure the reason people are going to have this, right? You know, not even necessarily playing devil's advocate, just acknowledging... Sorry, give me a second. I'm having to find... There we go. The comparison. Oh, it's because they both have curved blades. It's because, you know, they both have pretty long hilt is the word I'm going to go with, but I know that's not the word. It's just the one that actually comes to my brain at the moment. But you can see one of these, the katana does also have a curved back edge. This has a fairly curved, fairly straight back edge. Yeah, I mean, cool. You're going to use them in very similar ways. You're going to be cutting, chopping. This is going to be used in a similar method into how you're going to slice with a katana. However, this does have my fat head. Okay, my fat head isn't hiding it. This is going to have a pommel for all intents and purposes. This doesn't have a pommel. I think both of these, assuming these are both full tang. This is a Suba. This has not only a full crossguard, but it has that little side bit, that little ring that the Messer have as well.
Different in terms of usage,
fairly different.
There's going to be more similarity, yeah. And you can use the spine of a Messer similar to the way it's described here. If you haven't yet, go check it out. Definitely fascinating to hear a different point of view. I generally like this sort of thing, comparing notes, as I like to call it, and just seeing how somebody with a different background approaches the same thing. I definitely see plenty of overlap between European and Japanese swordsmanship because, like I said before, there are only so many ways you can effectively use these swords in a way.
That actually does come up. Skallagrim gives up a spectacular point where there's only so many ways the human body can move a thing. So yes, we can look at, say, 1600s Japan, right? We can look, where Musashi's at. We have Sasaku Kojiro Sasaki, right? We have him in that era. We have so many other swordsmen in that area. And then, there's absolutely someone that could have come over on a trade route and, maybe taught some people in Europe or taught some people in Eastern Europe, right? Absolutely, this could have happened. Or alternatively, there's only so many ways that you can move the human body in a specific way, right? If you are, like, say, using Niten Ishido, if you're using Musashi's, I almost said Sasaki. You can tell I've reacted to this for a hot minute. If you're using Musashi's two swords, right? His longer sword, shorter sword, right? And you look at something like, I believe it's like Florentine, I think is the Italian way of doing it. You might find some similarities because how does a human move two swords? Same thing, words and swords, kind of same thing depending on the period of history, right? If you have two swords, there's only so many ways that you can move these two swords in tandem with each other. So those are both valid explanations. One, absolutely, there could be trade routes. There could be, teachings from one side of the world brought to another side of the world and incorporated into existing teachings and lessons, right? Or it could just be humans come to the same conclusions in regard to how you move certain things.
It's biomechanically sound, but they definitely came up with their own flavor, I guess you could say, techniques that are different. And anyway, enough babbling. Hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching, and take care.
This is very interesting. I will have to reach out to the other individual in this, and I might cut this up depending. We'll see. You'll know once this goes live on the channel if this is cut up or not. But, I mean, this was really fascinating. As somebody that loves SEA, somebody that loves really a lost art, it seems, in regards to swordplay, other martial arts, etc. It's just one of those things that it's very interesting to me, and I feel more people want to engage in, but don't necessarily know how to or think they have high expectations of themselves. Go find your local SCA chapter. Go find your local HEMA chapter. Bellegarth, whoever, and just talk with them. Be like, hey, I'm interested in this. I have nowhere to really start from, or I've watched some Skallagrim videos. I'm kind of curious where to go. Just reach out. A lot are going to be more receptive than you think. But that'll do it for this time. What are your guys' thoughts? What are your guys' thoughts on logistics? Thoughts on styles? Thoughts on forms? You think a blade would be a good, a specific blade would be a good replacement for any of these listed here? Let me know in the comment section. And as always, stay awesome.